I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm okay. Thanks. Thanks for asking.
No problem.
So, yeah. The weather is nice. I was just talking about the weather, but yeah, I'm thankful that it's cooler now than in the last few weeks. It was really hot. But
It feels like
compared
it's
this,
completely
yeah.
for a long time.
Well, you know, compare this to the desert. I can't complain because when I used to work in India, 9 a.m. in the morning is like 97 degrees, and sometimes it's humid but mostly dry. So most of the students up there, they're either indoor, and one time the AC was broken and it was just miserable. So they had sent people home, but So when I would drive back home, because I live in Moreno Valley, and I would be so thankful to be back home because it would be so hot in the desert. And so I was teaching at two campuses. The main one, which is in Palm Desert, that's the main campus, and then I was teaching in Indio for some part during the summer. And when Coachella happens, that's when, we usually start the semester, and it's, or in the middle of the spring semester, and it would just be so crowded, you know.
I
So
bet. I can imagine.
yeah. So the commute was not great, but overall everything else was really cool. Okay. So is there any question or anything before we start? No questions? Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. I think a couple other people might join us for this evening, maybe. They'll come in shortly. So this week we are gonna work on the lab, which is gonna deal with mobile. So before, there's some areas that if you overlook in the hands-on project, you might miss it and you might run into problems. So I'll walk you through the lab, but I want to point out some of the resources that I added onto the lab page in case you work with the mobile environment. So likely that we will come across this when we do forensic. Now, the practice lab, they use Windows 8.1. You have to know that when they launched the tablet for Windows tablet, it was the time where Windows 8.0 was started to really pick up. They also release Nokia phones and some of the other phones that's Windows based. So this is why you see some of this in the lab, and it's easier for companies to simulate the lab using Windows environment. We know that when currently, if you work with mobile devices, you will likely see Android, iOS, right? So you will see less Windows, but we can look at some of the tools and some of the technique, which is going to be similar. So what I did was I posted the NIST guidelines to mobile devices forensic. This is a very large document, but many of the organization and agency, they follow this publication, especially when you deal with like Department of Defense, some of the larger agency and public entity, they would refer to this. And so the main difference between policy and guidelines is that guidelines give you recommendation of the procedure. So this is what we should follow. It's not mandatory, but we want to standardize across different branches and things like that. So we would refer to something like this, and they would update it with different revisions. So what you can do is you can go to the NIST website, which you will find a lot of the documentation being shared publicly. So this was, the people that were involved in this particular project. And as you can see, it ties back to Homeland Security and the entity with the larger agency. When you do have some time, you can take a look at some of the part on what they recommend as far as how to look at the characteristics of the smartphone, the memory location, so the hardware components, and then some of the forensic tools is in this section. It talks about, looking at SIM and looking at the internal memory. So this is a really good reference for you to use when you work with mobile devices, because even if you pay for a lot of the training, the simulator is always as good as it can get. Like they're going to use the image or the ISO from the more common one, and sometimes you do see some Android and some iOS, but would be a little harder to simulate that. So And in your lab, it touches on how to look at your SIM and looking at, the content like messages, and especially messages, SMS, your simple messages, text messages that's coming from the GSM network. Therefore, what I did was I also posted a couple other links, um, because when you start looking at mobile devices, a lot of the times we would investigate the communication content, things like SMS, your text messages, or even multimedia messages. And we touched a little bit in this week's lecture on how to look at web content. So we have to look at more on how cellular communication really get transferred across, and that's a little bit different to look at. So some of the resources for you, I posted this, I know it's from Wikipedia, but in the lab, there's a section where you have to take a look at your origination message. So when you take a look at an SMS, you know, when you export it from the phone into an application, what you will find is that we will have like an XML or a spreadsheet of all the text messages. Otherwise, it's going to be very huge, right? And then inside each, we can read the text messages as text. So a lot of these forensic tools, what they do is it will allow you to export the communication messages into a list, and then it also allows you to open it up in as a text file, so you can take a look at the content, what was said, what was sent. And in like the email, it would have a way to track the who sends that message, when it was sent. So there's some kind of logging process that happens. So one of the ways that we can use to track it is to use the originator address, and also it would have recipient address, who it's from and who it goes to, just like how you looked at the email. Okay, now so the addresses is really at a lower level, like it states here. And in this section, it kind of shows you how to really interpret it, because you're going to see a TOA and then a value like 112, or, TOA dash 224, some kind of number. Okay. So how we see this is that this is going to, at a lower layer, what that does is there's dedicated bits that's going to pertain to whether the sender and the recipient is international. Just like how when you call using your phone, you would have to put in like the country code. If we call it nationally, right, with the phone, it would put that 1 and then the area code, just like that, right? So because it's transitioning from the analog network into the digital network, we have to find a way that the communication header is going to be organized. So what that does is that they come up with the schematic on how these things would be standardized. So when you're looking at TOA or TON, what that does is it tells you the specific on what part of the world that caller and the sender and the recipient is from, what part of the country that person is from, what part of the network this person is using, and also the subscriber number, which is going to be pertaining to their account and their ID, not necessarily the full account information, but their ID with that service provider. And then also, right, some of the additional alphanumeric coded value that's used to transfer the digital data. And so there's some reserve extension that we don't get into, but for forensic, we're interested in this area. We wanted to know who, where are they sending it from and where are they receiving it, right? And so very much like looking at the phone number. Now, in the case where you have the sender and the receiver information, it will tie those entity to a number or an IP address. And you might not know which network, or it could be that they're using their network, the work network, or they could be using their home network. So if you have to investigate that, what you can use is, you probably heard of this before. If you haven't, right, I share some of the link, and there are other websites that you can use. But this one, it talks about how to look up IP, and we can find an IP address, could be also be virtual host, and tie that into what part of the network, what server. So in the case, if they're using something like Google Call or WhatsApp, or like Facebook calling, it's still gonna tie the system IP to the physical network that they are using, like home network or the network that they're connected to, or it could be at Starbucks, right? However, if they're using a third-party service like an application to communicate, what that will do is it's also going to tell us what other network is associated with that session. And this is why sometimes we also have to scan, right? We have to take a look at the network scan and such. But this is posted by Hacker Target, but it gives you a little bit more detail on how to go about looking up IP, reverse IP, which is, we have an IP address. We wanted to know what network that's coming from, right? So you can search for the host, and then based on the query, you can narrow it down. And sometimes you would have to, there are a lot of paid services similar to what they have talked about. And then there are also some free services, because all the DNSs are registered, right? And so let's say that if we're looking at Moreno Valley College, mvc.edu, when they register that, they register it to the district. So the registration information will also be different. So one of the things that you can use, and you might have learned this in your security class or another class, but you can use the service called Whois. And Whois also tells you, right, what network that IP is from, what DNS, if you're looking at a certain domain name server. And that's important for us to kind of see who that's registered to, because we're looking at things after the fact, like after the incident or the event. So Whois.net is also a good service to look at the domain information, right? And you can put in your IP address, website. So let's say that I do like this, okay? mvc.edu, it's gonna take that domain and it's gonna try to find which entity is registered to that domain, okay? And then if you have an IP address, you can also search it that way. So we have to use multiple resources to really pinpoint, right, some of the things that pinpoint some of the areas in our artifacts. Okay. Now so then you can set the filter, right? If I know it's education, I can set it like this, and things like that, so it would be able to narrow it down. Now if it doesn't find it, then you can also try like rccd.edu, so that way we have to kind of research a little bit and try to find it. Okay, but let me see. I know some of them, they also block it, like even if you do trace route, sometimes you can't find it. okay? Because some companies, they would have a security company that shields all of this. And so that way people cannot find more about their servers. It will reach their server, it just, you can't gather the information on it. Okay, and part of ethical hacking also looks into this area. So what I did was I added some information about IP reverse lookup. And then also when you're dealing with international phone number, if you have a phone number, you can also look up, you know, who that is, or, you know, who is that listed under, because it might not even be the person that's registered to that number. Right, it could be someone else that's using that phone or that smart devices. Okay, so there are resources online that you can take a look at. And just to touch back a little bit on GSM, if you learn networking, or if you look into like the mobile network, as far as the cellular network, the service provider that we have nationally, something like Verizon and T-Mobile, you also see different generations, like when we would say about 5G, 4G, 3G. So when we're talking about GSM is a little older, right? And that was used more for like the generation 3, the 3G, before the transition into the 4G directly. And then they move into a different type of standard and service for the cellular. So back then, what happens is it uses short messages, and you know, with the way the communication was, that it was limited in how your multimedia message is really translated between the 2G and the 3G. So, and if you look at some of the implementation of that, that was a long time ago, right? About, you know, so it's before the 2000s, so early 2000s. So we're looking at something that's older and that's more cellular based when you're looking at GSM. Okay, now for more of the current one, all our smart devices, you know, has been integrated with the newer generation of communication. So what you would have is more digital network, and it would have a public IP address. It's connected to that public IP address is connected to the service provider, and that service provider would have a list of, you know, who's registered with a certain IP address, just like, you know, because you subscribe for their service, of course. And within that, and they don't release that publicly, so you have to acquire that by going into that to that company and submitting the court order for that. So there's only so much information that we can find that's freely available. And then when it gets into people's domain and their resources, like we talked about on Monday, we have to ask. Okay. So this kind of gives you a little bit of understanding on how GSM works, and with this, like how it really breaks down, like how it transmit or transfer the message from one end to the other. Okay. Let's talk about the lab. I had it open. So the first page to this is just simply about, you know, the type of virtual machine that you're going to be using. So if you missed the beginning, I talk about how Windows 8.1 or 8.0 originally was used for Windows tablet. And then they later on upgraded it to 8.1. So the earlier Surface, right, the beginning of what we see as Microsoft Surface was at 8.1. And now all the new Surfaces comes with Windows 10. So Windows, you do see this with the mobile devices like the tablet. So the way the lab is written is really for a tablet. Okay. Or a mobile, a Windows phone, because they did have that. So at the beginning of the second page, which is project 12-1, you need to pay attention to this part when you do this first project. You have to extract the data. If it, when I went into it a few times, it shows that it's extracted. But if you want it, because they're not going to tell you where to look. This is a custom lab that we had worked through a company to select. So there was some portion that was removed from it. But you have to go into C drive, work data, files, and chapter 2. So when you're trying to find the Excel or the spreadsheet in step 2, it's going to be located in that location. Okay, it's going to be under C, work data, files, and chapter 12. So the first part is to navigate to see work data, files, and chapter 12. And you can simply use the file manager to do that. And then we want to right click the Sarah file here, right? And then what you're going to do is you are going to extract it. And if you click it open, it's going to automatically unpack it. And this is the content of it. Okay. They also had this is enable here, but so once you do that, then what you're going to do next is you are going to install OpenOffice. So just like Google Docs, right, or Google Spreadsheet, this is a suite of Office applications that's open source. It's often seen being used on Linux systems. It looks close to Microsoft Office, right? It doesn't have the exact same feature, but a lot of the similarity. So when you double click this, they tell you to use the desktop icon. Then all you have to do is to get the wizard, and we don't have to fill in anything. We click finish. So that just the wizard to launch the Office. Now I use OpenOffice quite a bit when I use the package to draw network diagram. There's a package that was created specifically for OpenOffice, because if you buy the tool from Microsoft, it's very expensive. So what I do for my students is I introduce them to OpenOffice, and if you don't want to install Office 365, this is a good option. Then you have text document, similarity to what you've seen in Office 365. Then there's your spreadsheet. Okay, so in the steps that's shown here, what it tells you is to open it up and then open up spreadsheet, click spreadsheet, and then you're gonna look at the phone, the messages that's from Sebastian's phone and messages from Now's phone. So what does that tell us? It tells us that when you're evaluating messages, what you need to do is if you have a tool, right? There are a lot of different types of open source and also commercial tool now for mobile devices. You need to export all the messages that you're trying to evaluate into pull the image, of course, and export it into some kind of list. So that way, some of the software, it will create the list for you, and then you can open up that file and see, and that's what we're doing. Then we're going to go ahead and click File, Open, and here, right, we're going to navigate to C drive, and then we're going to go to Work, Data Files, and Chapter 12. So these files was what was extracted. Okay, so we first we're going to open the Sebastian phone one. So I want to show you what that looks like. So the software, what it did was it puts these into a spreadsheet, and you have a timestamp. Okay, and then inside each of the listing, you would see that there's content of the message. Okay. Now, most forensic tool for mobile devices will allow you to do this. It can retrieve email, it can retrieve even delete messages in many cases. And then it will ask you like, do you want it to make like a certain, so if the application requires you to use it itself to open up the list, right, you have to do that. But in the other application, it will allow you to export it and it will look like this. Okay, so this shows us each of the message and then the timestamp of when it arrived at that system there. Okay, and then you can look further. Okay. So it shows the status received and read, because on SMS, what it does is, you can, if you message somebody nowadays, you can also tell, right? Because the system tells you on some of the smartphone, it tells you whether they're typing, right? It's all, they make it where it's almost like instant messages, but it's not, right? So on the text messages, you can see, so it keeps a status of how, if it's received or read. Okay, if it's received only, that means that they haven't opened it up, that it's arrived. But so here you can take a look at that. Okay, and then you can also filter out. So what in our case, maybe we can look at a specific timeline. Like let's say that if I'm only looking at the October messages, then I can filter out just to view October. Okay, so this kind of give you an idea. Now, why did I spend the time to explain about the origination number? See how the number here is? Okay, if you look, it's not necessarily a phone number. Okay, we talked about how you can look up somebody's phone number. That would be easy if it shows the phone number. But what if it shows the origination message like this? So earlier I put a link in the lab page for that. And the way it's interpreted is that certain bits is dedicated to country, nation, and network. Okay, so that tells us, and you have to be able to identify where is that coming from in some cases. Okay, any question? Okay, no question. Then next, similarly, you're gonna see Now's phone. That's the same. Okay, so after you look at this list, you're gonna go ahead and open up the next one. And again, it's in C Work Data Files Chapter 12. And then there is on the Now's phone. Okay. Now the other files right here, that's that's their contact list. Okay. So in smartphones, you will likely have to obtain, right, depending on the case, of course, but likely have to obtain a list of messages so you can have a picture of what was communicated, also their contact information, so their contact list, and then specific component of the communication. So let's open this up. Okay. Now we do see matching timeline between, the communicator and the recipient. So you can take a look. It looks similar, and then you got the responses and also the message. Okay. So that was the first part. Then we're gonna move to the next page after we take a look at those. And here it asks you, it says, take note of the items that they respond to each of the messages, the date, the time, what numbers they call. And you want to make note of that so you can put that on your report. Okay. And it also mentioned that it's not in chronological order. Depending on the application, some applications are more user-friendly than other, right? But in our case, the list is not in chronological order. So if you have it in spreadsheet, sometimes you can sort it, sometimes you can filter it. Now, if it's not in spreadsheet format, if they don't give you the capability to do XML file and import that in, then what you have to do is you have to be able to manually look, and that would take a long time if you have a lot. So on the second one, what they want to do here is they want you to open up the text file from each of the phone and look at it. And the way that we would do this is we would use, so I can close this now. We would use Notepad or any text editor, right? In the case where if you're using Terminal, you can use Vim. So, or you can install a text editor. So in Windows 8, what we will do is we will search for Notepad. And then you simply just go File, Open, and then we again navigate to C, Work, Data Files, Chapter 12. And here, let's look at the Nels phone real quick. So we see those text files, okay? Now, this was created by, it was gathered by a certain investigator at a certain time, so it tells you that there. So you kind of see how this is documented, okay? Now, and they could fill it out in an application, and then when they're done, it allows them to create this text file, okay? So in this one, we also see ciphering key and then sequence number for this particular device. So in a lot of the mobile forensic applications, you're gonna see that when you're going through the process, you can select certain things, right? Certain options, and also it's gonna look for like keys and things like that, and it's gonna put it on the report for you. Okay. So here what they have is they had identified some of the communication provider and area, the zone that's going to be affiliated with that particular device. So you can see South Africa, UK, France, Germany, Hong Kong, Italy, and it ties back to the mobile networks that the device was using. Okay. And the application logs the search period. Now, later on, you're gonna look at an exercise to do SIM table. But with the SIM, it's also gonna track some of the things that would pertain to that particular subscriber, right? Of course, because a SIM is tied to a device, which is tied to a subscriber. So here in this device, what we have is we have specific things that would tie to the device, like fixed dialing numbers, SMS, that was what was used. So these are the features really for that device. And you know that you can only use certain feature based on how it's activated, right? So, you know, when they give you the SIM for a smartphone, what that is that it entails specific information for the service that you're acquiring with that network, with that service provider. Okay. So here it gives you that information. So yes, SIM can definitely be a very useful source to get artifacts. Okay. And then some of the things that's not allocated that would not pertain to that. Then for the call meter, so back then, you know, they would charge based on the use of call communication and the use of text messages on GSM, meaning that, you know, you have a limited number of text messages, or, you know, there would be a scope, just like how you are governed by the data transfer ceiling that they have now for service providers. So it transitioned and changed a lot. However, it has to go when it communicates and send. What that will do is it needs to be able to communicate back to the cellular network, so it would have a way to identify that cellular network, and that's what you see tracking here for the broadcast message. Okay, so this report goes a lot further, but I just want to point out some of the things for you to look at there. Very interesting. And so you can see, and you know, even with encrypted communication, we do see some of the tool that we use that it's going to be able to acquire that key. That key is really important for us, because in some cases where we need to use that key to decrypt or to be able to access resources, we'll be able to do that. Okay. So later on, you would see the identifier and the number that pertains to that user ID. And I looked at the iPhones, right? The older iPhones, it was very transparent on how it's listed the user ID, and it ties it back to the subscriber. And then here is our TPOA that was listed from our Excel or our spreadsheet. I keep saying Excel, it's not Excel, Open Office spreadsheet. And that on how the short messages were delivered. And then also pertaining to voicemail, because in some cases you have to look at voicemail and voicemail box, right? And it uses some kind of access code and key as well to access. So when you check your voicemail, it's automated now, but really it has to authenticate that device to that box, that storage that's on their server. Okay. So here it gives you the specific. Any question? Okay. Now, for the second part, it shows you how to really have an example and list some of the example that in the example they show different areas, right? Cellular broadcast, subscriber identity. Those are some of the things that you want to be able to pinpoint. Okay, and then the TPOA, we talked about that, and the value for each one that kind of show us who they are, what network they're using. Okay, so on this one, what you're going to do is you're going to download the SIM manager. Once you download the SIM manager, and simply you can go, let me close this. You can go into the IE here, right? Go let me see if I can click back and reopen. So just like the other tool, we would use the data forensic, and then we would download the SIM manager. Once you have it downloaded, you have to extract it. That's how they're able to share file on these virtual machines. and then you would do the installation. So let me see if I can do a quick download with this as I reset this machine from earlier. So go into the intranet under tools. So once you click tool, you're going to go into data forensic, and then here's the sim manager.zip. Save. We want to save because we want to be able to extract it. And then you can click open. So in the downloads, what we can do is we can right click it, and then we can simply extract all. So now here, excuse me, when you launch the sim manager on your desktop after you install it, so once you extract it, it's going to ask you to install. Then when you click install, after you finish install, you're gonna you are going to launch a sim manager. And then we are going to go back to the folder in chapter 12, and then we're going to look at the PNH or PHN file. So this particular application allows you to open up the sim file from that device. Okay. What that does is, because people store contact lists on the storage, right, on the system, it's able to give you the contact list information. Okay. And then we would examine the messages. So here is the installation part of it. So we have to accept the agreement. We're going to go next and then finish the setup. And for me, I felt like, you know, on this one, it's a little bit faster that we're not sharing this virtual machine right now with a lot of people, but could be time, it could be very crawling slow. Okay. And it's such a small program right now that it's going to install quickly. Okay. So once you have the sim manager installed, what we will do is we will open up the PHN file, which allows us to see what? It allows us to see the phone book, really, because they label it like the phone book there. Okay. And then we have to evaluate the SMS messages. So to be able to see what was typed or sent and received by that particular device. And then you're going to do the same thing again for Now's phone. Okay. So if you now, that is if we're looking at smartphones that's using SIM based, right? And then you have the iOS devices, the new ones that are not using SIM based. So it also depends on the network. It depends on the device that's in that network. And so mobile devices is always changing. So when you're looking at technique, overall, what we're really getting from this is that when what kind of evidence do we want to pull? We want to pull the message list, we want to pull contact lists, we want to evaluate individual message. And then from all of these things, what we can put together is a report about the network, about the individual, about the content of the message, what was communicated, and that will help us build our case. Okay. So any question? Let me check back on mine here. Okay. So don't forget about extraction of the SIM manager and installing it. So your SIM manager, once it's installed, it's located here. So if you have an old smartphone that was using AT&T and or if you even have an old Windows phone, you can replicate this step, right? but and took my computer data, just check. All right, yeah, that was just a protection type of message. So this is the interface, and then we will click open. Then we can go to C, then we go to work, we go to data files, chapter 12, and voila. So I'm gonna look at Nell's phone. Okay, so in here it gives you the hierarchy. Okay, so here's our contact. There's only one name and phone number, but realistically, right, we all know that most users would have many names and many different phone numbers on there. Its own phone number is not listed. And then if they call, it should also list that. It would track that on the SIM. Fixed dialing number. So these details here, even though the exercise doesn't really mention it, but you should take a look at some of the other areas as well. Service dialing number, and then your SMS. So here are the messages. And in this case, they only pull it the way that we have it is only for October and November. Don't be surprised if you do try this on your old devices and such. It's gonna give you a lot, right? Using forensic software, sometime it would also pull the deleted things, because if it's using all the devices now uses flash technology, and that what will happen is some of the stuff don't get rewritten, so it's still able to pull some of the content or the header of that message from that devices. So you will have a lot to go through, and then you have to filter it down. So here's another way that we can take a look at the message, what was sent, what was communicated, origination number. Okay, so this is a different way to look at the device itself or investigate it. And then on the left here, you have the functionality with the read, write, set pin, etc. Okay. So as an investigator, what you can do is you can print this, right? Or you can save it as a PDF so you can use it for your report later. And we want to incorporate this with our evidence report. Any question? Okay. So here it tells you to print the messages, compare the two sets. So we're going to take a look at the other one, and we wanted to see if there's similarity, if they were communicating with each other. Now, in this case, you're able to investigate both devices, right? In the majority of the case, you might only have one, like either the sender or the recipient, and then you have to ask service provider for authorization for the other party to be able to pull it from their server or to obtain it elsewhere. So, that would take longer time, more effort. And so we want to kind of start with the one and give ourselves a time window, right? Like a timeline of how that would look like. Okay, any question? So I still think even though it's a shorter exercise, it's pretty cool, right? It gives you a little bit more practice on how to work with smart devices. Okay, and then as I mentioned in all the other lab, it's important that we take a look at the summary because it gives you additional resources about the VMware using the virtualization technology, and also some information about RAM and live acquisition. Now, this lab is written for a Cengage textbook that has the specific what I will do is I will share one of the, I found the chapter and the content of it, which is chapter 12 in that particular textbook. And what I will do is I will add that to your note page. So that way, if you wanted to take a look at, you know, how is it different? What we're missing from this particular lab, because the beginning of the lab itself is actually using some of the tools, and then using the sim at the end. Okay, and then next week we will get more into this, and then we will talk about reporting and, you know, finalizing some of the evidence and then tracking some of the evidence, and that will wrap up our class. But I plan to give you a quiz review assignment next week, and then we have a quiz after that. Also with the project, what I will do is I'm rethinking it. So I might make a virtual machine and then put things in it and have you make an image of it. But I was thinking about how if you have OS X at home and if you're running the virtual machine, that might be harder for you. So it might not work if that's the case. So I might just create a DD file, and then you can just make a copy of that DD file and then be evaluating the DD file. And then I will give you a list of things that you need to look for, and you will put together a report based on what you find. So it's kind of like treasure hunting. So your goal is to meet all the requirement for that list, of course. And then, you know, put together a summary report that will be for our project. Okay, so it kind of wrap up everything that we've been doing so far, and to be able to do that. Now, if like I said, if the virtual machine, I don't plan it to be very large, but in the case where once I added all the content, like graphic files and things like that, if it gets to be very, very large, then you cannot download it, and then I will see if I can put it on USB and mail it to you. So that might take a couple of days, just for you to get it. And once you have it, right, ideally, I recommend that you use a virtual machine, like what we've been doing in practice lab, and then to install some of the open source tool, or the free trial-based tool to be able to analyze it. Okay, so we're going to look at files, we're going to look at partitions, we're going to look at emails, we're going to look at web content, and then we're going to put together the big picture, a timeline, and everything else for that case. Okay, any question? All right, no question. So once you're done, make sure you click done, and then you can close it, right? But make sure you complete all the steps that it's asked you to. And I had shared some of the links there for you to look at. So NIST guideline, GSM information, especially with this lab, how to look up IP addresses, reverse, and I will add, so here's the who is. I didn't have that there, but I'll add that onto the lab page. Okay. And then also international phone number reverse lookup. So if you do have a phone number, you can look it up. Questions? No question. Okay. So sorry, my video keep going in and out. I will stay on a little bit. I think that's all I wanted to demonstrate today. And then I will get off Zoom if you don't have any questions so you can complete it and not have to worry about it this weekend. But I will stick around for a little bit more to answer questions in case you have questions. Anything? Okay, so I have everybody here tonight. Good job.
See you next week.
Chris?
No, it's just saying see you next week.
Okay, make sure you complete your lab. Have a good one. Yeah, if you wanted to get off Zoom so you can do practice lab, you're okay to do that.
All right. Thank you.
No, I don't do midterm, everyone. I do quizzes and I do project. So some people do midterm, but I do periodic quizzes and I do project. Okay. So, and project is kind of like a capstone project. So it covers all the content we talked about. So we can start that in a couple of weeks.
Okay, so I forgot to say, when are you gonna start putting the projects for Python?
I just got an email from Dr. Joanna Warner Fracek just now. So until, because that was the bird research part was one of the options. So I have to tie that in now. So let me take a look at her species and and how to go about converting that over to the requirement of our project. So hopefully I'll get it up next week. I
Okay.
have to finalize it with that option.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm interested on that one because I think that one's gonna test my skills more.
Okay, perfect. Then I told her that their students are interested in doing that. So yeah, I will put that up. And then as far as this class, maybe we're looking at like maybe going into week 11 or so. And that should give you an ample 5 weeks to get all of that done. And it doesn't take very long once you have all the tools set up. And if you do want to use the same one from practice lab, you can use OS forensic free trial one and be able to do that. Okay.
Okay. Alrighty.
All right.
Thanks. See you next week.
Yeah. Bye. Other questions? I'm going to stop recording. I'll stick around if you have questions.